Hello, I'm Angela Garbutt and I'm an Associate Director of English for NET. So we're going to look at the Year 9 scheme of work for Term 1B, which is Hub 2, and it's Poetry Over Time. I want you to have a look at what the scheme looks like. So we'll have a little run through that. I want you to also think about how the scheme is broken down and how they link together to other schemes of work and obviously within the curriculum also. And I want you to remember that no matter what you're studying, that poems are just texts. They're nothing to be worried about. Really, the poems are a vehicle for knowledge and for skills, and that's the most important aspect that we really need to consider. Remember, whatever we're going through, it's the skills that we are continuously revisiting, which leads up to their GCSE in Year 11. So if we're looking at the curriculum overview of 2020 to 2021, we can clearly see where the Year 9 Poetry Over Time scheme sits, and this is in Term 1B. We can also look back and we can see how students in Year 7 and Year 8 have also studied poetry over time. So the skills are constantly being revisited and constantly being developed. We also know how the concepts are also being threaded throughout, so we'll always see this familiarity. So if I'm looking, for example, at Hub 1 in Year 9, I know that they studied the prelude, so perhaps thinking about the power of nature. Now, obviously, that would make a clear link to Wilfred Owen's Exposure. So we can see again how this thread continues throughout the curriculum. And again, it builds on again and for those skills to develop so students are then becoming GCSE ready. Okay, so now we'll be able to see how the poetry is tracked across the curriculum. So in Year 7, students will study 7 poems, and that's the People, Places, Power and Poetry anthology. In Year 8, students will study 14 poems, and that's the People and Power anthology. And then moving into Year 9 to 11, the students will study the 15 poems, which are the Conflict and Power Poetry anthology in preparation for their GCSE. Not only are the poets from the literary canon, but also we'll be able to see how they do link in preparation for that GCSE. So if we're looking in Year 7, we'll be able to see, for example, Wilfred Owen, Arms and the Boy. Moving into Year 8, we've got Wilfred Owen, Dulce et Decorum Est, and then finally moving into the Conflict and Power Poetry anthology, we've got Wilfred Owen, Exposure. One thing that should be clear throughout all of those poems is about the disillusionment of war. So you'll be able to see already how the students are beginning to layer up their knowledge and understanding so that by the time they get into Year 11 in preparation for their GCSE, they're starting to have a clear overview of the poets and the context behind some of their poems. Looking at the topic overview, looking at Year 9, we can see we're looking at Term 1A to 1B, and that's because the Power and Conflict poetry of Hub 2 crosses over those 2 half terms. It has a clear GCSE link to English Literature Paper 2, Section B. So what we're studying currently builds from the poetry anthology in Year 7, Term 1B, the poetry anthology in Year 8, in Term 1B as well. And now we know that we're looking at the AQA Power and Conflict anthology, which again is going to link to the English Literature Paper 2, Section B. We can see the text, the poems that we're looking at currently as well. Moving on, we can see the cultural heritage overview as well. So we're looking at poetry. We know that the time period is going to be the 18th to the 19th century and also including the 20th to the 21st century. And our British values are going to be democracy, the rule of law, individual liberty, mutual respect and tolerance. Again, discussing the conceptual threads that have been mentioned previously, we're looking at power, conflict, relationship, society, the struggle of self-definition, appearance and reality. However, you'll see on the left-hand side the 4 key concepts. And you've probably seen this in the talk through from Ashley Potts as well. So everything that you've discussed in this particular scheme of work will have been discussed previously to those concepts as well, and will continue to be discussed as well into GCSE. We're thinking about poetry as well, particularly when you get to the unseen poetry. Students have really got a really clear opening when they start talking about those concepts initially. So it allows them to immediately go straight into analysing those poems. So let's look at our phased vocabulary. It's in different sections. We can see our Dirty 30 section, and these build upon two other sections, one in year 7 and one in year 8. These were seen to be a lot of the common errors that students were still continuing at GCSEs, and a lot of the words that they've covered were also in Key Stage 2 SATs. For me, looking at this, I'd look at the root word and then think about prefixes and suffix. So for example, if I was looking at beginning, I would know that begin is the root word, and then I would be showing students how they could add that suffix towards the end to change the tense of it. Also moving on to our reading analysis words. So for example, for argument, shows, style, the perspective of the author, verbs for the writer's intent and effect. We've got a variety of vocabulary that we're allowing to develop on previous vocabulary. So again, we're giving the students the opportunity to have that breadth of vocabulary so they can use that towards their GCSEs. Moving on to the themed vocabulary. And you'll see how this is something that we keep revisiting constantly. So again, it's a variation of the concepts that we've looked at previously. So for example, thinking about control, also loyalty, power, selfishness, group, and the individual, and those are all clearly linked into the scheme of work of poetry over time. So thinking about year 9, we can see how the phased content can... So looking at the phased content within year 9 as well, we can see how this builds from year 7 and year 8. We're looking at 3 key components, so the context, the terminology and technical elements to it, and also the key concepts. So it gives you a clear overview how it moves from what they've been taught in year 7 and how those again move across and refine as they move into year 8. So for example, in year 7, looking at the imageries, the metaphors, similes, personification. Then if you look at year 8, we can see the imagery. Not only are they looking at the metaphor, simile and personification, then we're starting to build upon pathetic fallacy and symbolism. So the content overview is for you to have a clear understanding of what's expected to be covered within that particular week. So for example, if we were looking at week 5, we know that war photographer and remains will be covered. You can look at the additional ideas of social context, the mental torment as well. So the first lesson will be recapping the previous week, the skills, the application, vocabulary, any new content to remains and a range of poetic devices, and that will again move throughout, so you can see how the students by the end of the week will be able to do a review and an assessment through a real exam time task. Again, it will give you a clear focus as to what they're looking at, and it'll be English Literature Paper 2 Section B, so we know exactly where they're going with this. A suggested homework task would be a very short homework such as Duffy and Armitage, looking at some contextual research. As we've mentioned previously, remember this is layering from year 7, year 8 and to year 9. So again, it's just deepening their knowledge and their understanding of context, which will reinforce them in using those skills in year 11 and their GCSE. Looking at the content overview, this gives you a weekly focus of what's expected to be covered within that particular week. So it'll give you an opportunity to see where you're beginning at the start of that week and what you want your students to achieve at the end of the week. So for example, if we were looking at week 5, we're looking at war photographer and remains, the social context and the mental torment. Looking through the lessons, it will give you an overview of what's expected within those lessons. So, for example, looking at the imagery, looking at the concepts and the poetic devices. Because remember, we're not looking at the poems as each individual poem, we're looking at the skills and how we can develop those skills so that they can begin to show a deeper level of analysis. So then we move on to an additional layer, and there is a lesson by lesson breakdown. This is ideal for you, especially so you can plan your lesson and tweak it so it's appropriate for your students and also for their ability. However, it gives you the main skeleton of what's expected within that lesson, and you've also got that skeleton of a lesson for you to tweak it for your students. You can see what the focus will be, and you've got your clear objectives of the Aspire and Challenge. However, please adapt those to match the ability of your students. So you wouldn't expect your head of department to go round to each class and expect to see a high ability class with exactly the same Aspire and Challenge as a low ability class. So please be mindful of those. It gives you a breakdown of what expected, but again, I would always adapt. And you've also got a notes section on the breakdown for you to make any annotations. So when they're in your active folders, you can talk your way through, for example, with your head of department or Ofsted as to why you've adapted a particular task. It also gives you key questions that you can slot in when you're evaluating and seeing whether or not the student has understood what's expected. So looking at the first two poems for Hub 2, our Bayonet Charge and the Charge of the Light Brigade, immediately we'll see how the men are represented as being powerless. In Bayonet Charged, we're straight into the centre of the action. We're part of it. And because of this, the structure becomes really frantic. It's almost like a fight or flight attitude when we've got this suddenly he awoke and was running raw in raw seamed hot khaki, his sweat heavy. So we've got this kind of urgency. Whereas in the Charge of the Light Brigade, we've got this outsider's perspective. The structure is futile here because it's implying that they're not going to return, and they are very aware of this. The commands that are shown here show that there is a sense of purpose. So, for example, it says like forward the Light Brigade. So we can see that there is a sense of purpose. It's also got a sinister tone, hasn't it, when it's talking about the jaws of death, foreshadowing the death of the 600. However, when we're looking at Bayonet Charge, it's more impersonal. It says, those impersonal pronouns of he, so that it could be anyone experiencing this. And when we're talking about how, time here was the hand pointing, it's producing this imagery of a time that stood still, that he's unable to move. And again, perhaps making us consider, whether or not he will face death or will he be able to survive at this point in time. So thinking about the concept that we've looked at previously and how they can thread through those are going to be the main anchor for your poems. So thinking about the power, think about the conflict that's there, and how these men have been placed into this because of the establishments. Also thinking beyond this, remember when we've talked about love or relationships, you can always think about beyond the poem, the relationships that are being ignored, the relationships that are going to die because of the men who are left in war, and that those people are never considered beyond the poems. So drawing this together, we've had a look at what the scheme looks like and how the scheme is broken down and linked together. We've constantly reminded ourselves that these poems are just texts. They're nothing to be worried about, because actually what you're focusing on is the knowledge and the skills, and that's the most necessary part of this. The poems are just a vehicle for that. So just to remind ourselves, we need to keep reflecting on year 7 and year 8 so that students can see how everything has got that particular thread that links it through. Also, where it's going to be leading to as well. Now, this can clearly be identified in their SOAPs, which students will have in their exercise books. I think I would make sure I'm referring to that SOAP at the beginning of the week so we can see exactly where we're referring to, what we did in the previous week, where we were building those skills from, and where we're moving towards as well. I hope this has helped. If you've got any questions, please don't hesitate to get in touch with me. And I think my email is on the first slide. Thank you.